Please, sir. She can't stay here anymore, the head nurse snapped, pulling the arm of a frail, elderly black woman. Two orderlies dragged her through the corridor as patients watched in hushed pity. Her slippers scraped against the tiles. A torn Bible slipped from her hands. Across the lobby, a man in a charcoal suit froze mid-signature, his pen hovering above a $500,000 donation check. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to Dark Truths, where real racism stories turn into real justice. The man was Malik Reynolds, CEO of Rain Tech Construction, one of Chicago's largest black-owned companies. He had come here to make a charitable donation in his late father's name, a simple act of gratitude. But what he was seeing felt wrong. Stop, what's happening here? Malik's voice cut through the noise. The nurse straightened her scrubs. Mr. Reynolds, this patient has been causing trouble. We're just escorting her back to her room. The old woman lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were glassy but sharp for one brief second. Then she whispered, "Malik?" The pen slipped from his hand and hit the floor. He stared at her, heart pounding. Nobody here knew his first name. Not the press, not the staff, no one. "Do you know her?" his assistant asked quietly. Malik took a step closer. There was something in her face, a gentleness he could almost place. A flash of memory rose like a ghost. A soft lullaby, a warm hand wiping tears, the smell of cookies and soap. The nurse sighed. She calls every man that. She thinks everyone's her son. It's part of her dementia. Malik's jaw tightened. "What's her name?" "Rosa Johnson." The sound hit him like a thunderclap. That name lived somewhere deep in his childhood, a song he had forgotten how to sing. "Rosa," he whispered. "Mama Rosa?" The woman looked up, eyes shining. "My boy, you came back." The orderlies froze. The nurse rolled her eyes. She does that with everyone. But Malik was no longer listening. His heartbeat filled his ears. Everything around him blurred. He remembered being 5, cry in a dark room, a soft voice singing him back to sleep. That voice was hers. "Where's her room?" he asked. "Mr. Reynolds, this is a restricted area. Where's her room?" His tone made everyone move. He helped her walk back down the hall. The room was bare, no photos, no flowers, just a thin blanket and that Bible on the nightstand. "Do you remember me?" he asked softly. She smiled weakly. "How could I forget my boy?" "Who told you I'd come?" "They said you'd be better off without me," she murmured. "They said a poor black woman don't deserve to raise a child meant for rich folks." Malik swallowed hard. Those words cut like glass. Behind him, the nurse cleared her throat. "Mr. Reynolds, shall we finish the donation paperwork?" He turned slowly. "Cancel the donation?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Not 1 cent until I know how this place treats its people." He walked out, cameras flashing in the lobby where reporters waited for a photo of a generous donor. They got a headline instead. "Black CEO halts $500,000 donation after witnessing elderly abuse." That night, Malik sat awake in his penthouse, the rain tapping the windows. He could still hear her voice, "My boy, you came back." If Rosa Johnson was who he thought she was, then his whole life was built on a lie, and someone was going to pay for it. Malik couldn't sleep that night. The city lights outside his penthouse flickered like restless memories. He poured himself another coffee and stared at the photograph he'd taken from a nursing home file. Rosa Johnson, age 72, diagnosis, dementia. But her eyes in that picture weren't lost. They were awake. They were his eyes. He whispered to himself, "Who are you really, Rosa?" The next morning, he was back at Golden Years Nursing Home, before sunrise. This time, no cameras, no suits, just a hoodie, dark jeans, and a man who needed the truth more than air. At the reception desk, a softer-spoken nurse greeted him. Her tag read Helen Wells. "You here to see Miss Rosa again?" she asked. "Yes." "Please don't announce me." Helen smiled sadly. "She's been talking about you all night. Said her boy finally came home." Malik followed her through the quiet corridor. The air smelled of bleach and old dust. Rosa's door was half open. She sat by the window, sunlight brushing her silver hair. humming a tune he somehow remembered but couldn't name. "Morning, Mama Rosa," he said quietly. She turned, her face lighting up. "I told him you'd come back." He pulled a chair beside her. "How did you know my name?" She smiled, thin and wise. "Because I gave it to you. Malik means king. I wanted you to grow proud, not afraid." He froze. "You named me?" She nodded. "When they came for you, I begged them to let me hold you one last time. They said I wasn't fit, that a black maid had no business raising a child born for better things." His throat tightened. "Who told you that?" "A man in a gray suit. Charles Morrison. He worked for the state, or that's what he claimed." Malik leaned forward. "Morrison Associates. My father used their firm for years." Rosa's eyes dimmed. "They gave me papers to sign. I couldn't read all the words. They said if I didn't, they'd arrest me for kidnapping my own boy." He closed his eyes, rage crawling beneath his skin. 30 years, and nobody questioned it. Rosa reached for his hand. "You don't have to carry the hate, baby." He shook his head. "Someone has to carry the truth." She smiled softly. "You sound just like your real father." He blinked. "My real father?" She nodded. "A kind man named Elijah. He worked the docks. Died when you were 2. You had his stubborn eyes." Malik sat back, exhaling. His whole life, a story written by strangers. A small silence filled the room. Outside, birds chirped faintly in the cold. Rosa whispered, "I dreamed of this day every night. I'd see you in a suit, standing tall, and I'd say, 'That's my boy.' And now you're really here." He smiled weakly. "I'm here, Mama, and I'm not leaving you again." Helen knocked gently on the doorframe. "Visiting hours end soon." Rosa looked up. "Just 5 more minutes, honey." The nurse nodded kindly and left. Malik stood and adjusted the blanket around Rosa's shoulders. "Tomorrow, I'll take you out of here. Somewhere safe, somewhere new." Her eyes brightened like a child's. "You promise?" "I promise." He turned toward the door, but her voice stopped him. "Be careful, Malik. These people, they don't like their sins uncovered." He glanced back. "Neither do I." Outside, wind swept across the parking lot as he climbed into his car. His phone buzzed. A message from Andre, his assistant. Found something on Morrison Associates. Multiple sealed adoption cases. Looks bad. Malik, type back, pull everything. Every name, every date. Start tonight. He set the phone aside and looked at the photograph again. Rosa in her maid's uniform, holding a laughing little boy in front of a mansion he now recognized. The caption in his mind finished the picture. She wasn't just my nanny. She was my mother. The rain began to fall again, tapping the windshield like a heartbeat. Malik started the engine. "You took 30 years from her," he muttered. "Now I'm taking everything back." The car disappeared into the storm, and for the first time, Rosa Johnson slept peacefully because her boy had finally remembered her name. Malik sat at his desk, staring at 2 photographs laid side by side, one of him and his adoptive parents, smiling on a marble staircase, and the other, a faded Polaroid of Rosa holding a little boy in front of that same staircase. Same chandelier, same walls, but Rosa was erased from every family album like she never existed. He opened an old home video file, labeled Family 1991. Static buzzed, then a younger Malik appeared, chasing a ball across the mansion lawn. A woman's voice off-screen laughed. "Be careful, baby." He froze the frame. That voice wasn't Margaret Reynolds. It was Rosa. He pressed rewind, slow motion, listening again to her laugh. Then another voice entered, cold, commanding. "Cut the camera." His father, Richard. The clip ended abruptly. Malik leaned back, whispering, "You buried her in my memories, but not deep enough." He grabbed his coat and drove through the storm to the old mansion. The gate still opened for him automatically. Legacy had its privileges. Inside, the air smelled of polish and distance. His father's study door stood half open, light spilling through. Richard Reynolds looked up from a whiskey glass. "Son, I was wondering when you'd show up. You caused quite the scandal." Malik didn't sit. "I came for answers." Richard smirked. You already have everything you need. Malik dropped a file on the desk. No, I have proof. Rosa Johnson, you remember her? Richard's smile faltered. Briefly employed. Troubled. The state. Don't. Malik cut in. You had her declared unstable so you could take her child. Richard's voice sharpened. Watch your accusations. Malik stepped closer. She was my mother. Silence filled the room, heavy as thunder. Finally, Richard sighed. We gave you opportunity. The kind she never could. Malik's tone turned cold. You gave me a lie wrapped in privilege. Richard slammed his glass down. Without me, you'd be nothing. You think the world would have welcomed you? A black boy in Chicago's elite? I saved you. Malik's voice dropped. You stole me. The words hung between them. Richard turned away, pacing toward the window. That woman would have dragged you down. She was poor, uneducated, unstable. She was strong. Malik snapped. You broke her to make yourself righteous. Richard faced him, jaw tight. You're my son. Malik shook his head. You're just the man who bought the paperwork. He left the study before his father could answer. Rain hammered the roof as he stepped outside. Each drop sounded like a clock ticking down to war. At midnight, Malik's phone rang. Andre's voice came quick. Boss, I found something. Morris & Associates. They handled over 50 special adoptions in the 90s. Same wording on every file. Racial environment adjustment. Malik gripped the wheel. Send me everything. Already did. And, your father's name is on half of them. Malik pulled over under a streetlight, staring at the new documents flooding his screen. Contracts, doctor reports, false evaluations. Every one stamped by the same lawyer, Charles Morrison. The justifications all sounded alike. Caregiver unfit. Child reassigned for social stability. He whispered, social stability, code for white comfort. Another message popped up, a scanned medical order. Sedation approved for Rosa Johnson until further notice. Signed R. Reynolds. Malik's hand shook. His entire body felt like fire trapped in ice. Andre's voice came again. What do we do? Malik answered slowly. We dig until the ground bleeds. The next day, Malik returned to Rosa's room. She was folding clothes that didn't need folding, humming softly. He sat beside her. Mama, I found proof. They wrote reports calling you unstable. Rosa smiled sadly. Baby, they always find fancy words to hide ugly deeds. I'm going to expose them all. Be careful, she whispered. Powerful folks don't like their ghosts disturbed. Malik met her eyes. Then I'll bring the light. She touched his cheek. You look just like Elijah when you're angry. Elijah, your real father. He was stubborn too. Malik smiled faintly. Guess I inherited that. He took her hand. I promise, Mama, they'll pay for what they did. Rosa nodded gently. Just don't lose yourself trying to find justice. He kissed her forehead. Justice is myself. Back in his car, Malik opened one last document Andre had decrypted. It read, transfer a minor from caregiver Rosa Johnson to guardians Richard Margaret Reynolds. Reason, racial mismatch for future environment. He stared at the words until they blurred. Every breath felt heavier. Then he whispered, you erased her for being black. He looked out at the city skyline. Lightning flashed across the towers. His reflection caught in the glass, half light, half shadow. He spoke softly, as if to his father, as if to the world. You buried the truth to protect your name. Now I'll use that same name to destroy yours. He started the engine. Thunder rolled behind him like applause for the storm he was about to unleash. They locked my mother away for being black, Malik said quietly, his voice echoing in the empty boardroom. Now I'll lock every one of them behind bars. If you're still here, subscribe to Dark Truths, where injustice meets revenge with real-life power. Andre looked up from his laptop, stunned. You serious, boss? These people run half the city. Malik leaned forward, his face half lit by the glow of the projector. Then we start with a half I can reach. On the screen, a digital map filled the wall. Lines connecting Morrison Associates to nursing homes, private hospitals, and hidden trust funds. Every dollar that flowed through these accounts came from Reynolds Enterprises. Malik said, "My father's company financed their crimes." Andre whistled low. "You're going to detonate your own family name." Malik's eyes hardened. "Good. It's time everyone heard the explosion." He started pacing. "We'll trace every case. Every woman they called unstable. Find them. Get statements, medical records, anything they buried." Andre typed fast. "We'll need investigators, lawyers, press connections." "Then hire them," Malik said. "No leaks until I say so." For hours they worked. Printing, scanning, connecting red strings across the glass wall. Each line was a stolen life leading back to one man, Richard Reynolds. 2 nights later, Malik met a woman named Carmen Rodriguez in a rundown diner. She was in her 50s, hands trembling as she stirred her coffee. "They took my twin boys," she said softly. "Said I was unstable. I was just poor." Malik recorded every word. "Who signed your papers?" "Same name," she whispered. "Charles Morrison." Malik nodded. "You're not alone anymore." He left the diner with her statement, and dozens of others building a pattern. Back in his car, he murmured to himself, "Justice isn't revenge. It's accounting." Days blurred into nights. Rosa's face stayed on his desk, her smile the fuel that kept him going. Andre entered one evening holding a file. "Boss, this prosecutor you mentioned, Janet Williams, she's clean. Federal. Doesn't take bribes." "Perfect," Malik said. "Set the meeting." In Janet's office, the walls were lined with framed convictions. She flipped through Malik's files, eyes narrowing. "If this is real, it's systemic kidnapping under legal cover." Malik nodded. "Then you'll need to make it national." Janet looked up. "And you'll need to testify against your father." Malik didn't blink. "I already started." She smirked. "You Reynolds boys sure love building things." "Yeah," he said. "This time I'm building a reckoning." That night, Malik went to see Rosa again. She was stronger now, sitting upright and sewing a blanket. "What are you making?" he asked. "A gift," she said, "for all the children they took." He sat beside her. "I met the prosecutor. We're going to trial." Rosa smiled faintly. "Justice is heavy, baby. Make sure you can lift it." "I can," he said quietly. "I've carried it my whole life without knowing." Her eyes softened. "Don't let their hate change your heart." He took her hand. "It already changed my purpose." Midnight. The city hummed outside his office windows. Andre burst in. "Boss, we traced the offshore accounts. Morrison's firm moved $5 million last night." "They're running," Malik muttered. "What do we do?" "We chase them, but through the law and not the street." Andre hesitated. "Going public means blowing your cover." Malik's voice turned sharp. The cover was a crime. He dialed Janet. "It's time. Pull the warrants." Her voice came steady. "Then may God stand on the right side of this mess." Malik ended the call and looked out over Chicago, the lights below shimmering like a battlefield waiting for dawn. He whispered, "They took 30 years from her. Now they'll serve everyone back in chains." Hours later, an unknown number flashed on his phone. A deep voice said, "Stop digging, or you'll end up like the maid who thought she could sue us." Malik answered calmly, "Then you already know what happens next." "I don't stop." He hung up, slipped the phone in his pocket, and stared at his reflection in the window. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him. Steady, inevitable. Andre entered quietly. "Boss, are we ready?" Malik nodded. "No more hiding. Tomorrow the world learns who built their empire on stolen mothers." He glanced at Rose's photograph one last time. "You wanted peace, Mama. I'll earn it for you." The thunder rolled over the skyline, like a drumline of justice, on its way. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. Chicago felt like it was washing away its sins. Malik parked outside the Reynolds mansion, the same house where his childhood began and his mother's pain was buried. He walked up the marble steps, folder of evidence under his arm. The door opened before he knocked. The butler looked nervous but stepped aside. Richard Reynolds sat behind his desk, whiskey glass in hand, calm as if the world still belonged to him. "You didn't call, son. I hear you've been busy ruining my name." Malik stayed standing. "Your name ruined itself." He dropped a folder on the table. Contracts, photos, court notices, and a Polaroid of Rosa holding him as a child. Richard's smile faded. "You've been digging into old wounds. That's dangerous." "They're not wounds," Malik said. "They're crimes." Richard's tone cooled. "You should be grateful, Malik. We gave you life you'd never have known." Malik stepped closer. "You didn't give me life. You stole it." Richard chuckled bitterly. "You think she could have raised you? She was poor, uneducated, unstable. I saved you. You saved yourself from guilt." Malik's voice rose. "You called her crazy because you couldn't stand the shame of a black woman loving what you thought you owned." Richard's glass slammed against the desk, whiskey spilling across the files. "Enough. That woman was a liability. She was my mother." The silence cracked like thunder. Richard's face hardened. "You're my son. You bear my name. You carry my legacy." Malik shook his head. "Legacy isn't ownership. It's truth. And I'm done living inside your lie." He turned toward the window. "The prosecutor has everything now. Janet Williams will file the case tomorrow. Morrison's firm is finished. And so are you." Richard rose slowly, voice trembling with rage. "You'll destroy this family. This family was destroyed the day you locked her away. Don't do this, Malik. You don't know how deep this goes." "I know enough," Malik said. "You made business out of racism and called it charity. You built wealth on the backs of mothers you erased." Richard's jaw tightened. "You'll lose everything." "I already did," Malik whispered. 30 years ago." Richard came around the desk, eyes cold. "You're throwing away your inheritance, your power, your future." Malik met his gaze. "Power built on pain isn't worth keeping." The thunder outside roared as if answering him. Richard grabbed his arm. "You're still my blood." Malik pulled away. "No, I'm her blood, and that's the difference." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy enough to break glass. Then Richard said quietly, "You think this world will thank you for tearing down your own father?" Malik looked him dead in the eyes. "I don't need thanks. I just need justice." Richard sneered. "You're naive. People like me built this country. People like her just clean up after it." Malik's voice broke through the room like a blade. "And people like me rebuild it." The two men stood inches apart, one trembling with rage, the other calm with conviction. Suddenly, a phone rang. Richard's hand shook as he grabbed it. "Hello?" A voice on the other end stammered. "Mr. Reynolds, the prosecutor just raided Morrison's office. They have everything, the offshore accounts, the adoption records." Richard froze. "What?" "They're coming for you next." Malik smirked. "Guess they're early." Richard lunged forward, shouting, "You fool! You think you're righteous? You just signed your own destruction." Malik turned for the door. "Then at least it'll be honest destruction." Richard shouted after him, "They'll tear you apart in the media." Malik stopped at the door. "They already did, for being black and successful. This time, they'll choke on the truth." Margaret appeared in the doorway, pale and trembling. "Richard, tell me it's not true." He said nothing. She looked at Malik, tears streaking her face. "You knew?" Malik's voice softened. "I found out the same way the world just did." She sobbed. "I loved you like my own." He nodded slowly. "Then you should have protected me like your own." Outside, sirens grew louder. Blue and red lights flashed through the rain-streaked windows. Richard's voice cracked. "You've doomed us." Malik's reply was steady. "No, Dad, you doomed yourself." The front doors burst open. Federal agents stormed in with badges raised. "Richard Reynolds, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful detainment." Malik stepped aside as they handcuffed him. Richard looked up, eyes burning with disbelief. "You're no son of mine." Malik met his gaze calmly. "Finally, something we agree on." He walked down the long marble hallway while the agents read Richard his rights. Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing. Outside, the rain poured harder, but Malik didn't raise an umbrella. It felt like the city was baptizing him clean. Andre's car pulled up at the gate. He lowered the window. "Boss, it's over. They got everyone." Malik exhaled, shoulders heavy. "No, Andre, it's just beginning." He looked back once at the mansion, his childhood fortress now crawling with flashing lights and shattered illusions. Then he whispered, "For 30 years they made her disappear. Tonight, the world remembers her name." He got into the car, rain dripping from his hair, eyes forward toward the storm. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of thunder. He was the thunder. The courthouse was packed. Reporters filled every row, cameras flashing like lightning. At the front, Rosa Johnson sat quietly in her wheelchair, a blue shawl over her shoulders. Her eyes were calm, but her hands trembled slightly. 30 years of silence finally meeting daylight. Malik sat beside Prosecutor Janet Williams, expression cold, focused. Across the aisle, Richard Reynolds and his wife Margaret waited in cuffs, surrounded by lawyers and guards. Behind them sat executives from Morris & Associates, their expensive suits suddenly looking like prison uniforms and waiting. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Harper entered, gray-haired and steady. "This court will hear the case of the state versus Reynolds et al." Janet Williams stood, her voice carrying the calm power of a woman who knew truth was on her side. "Your Honor, what stands before you isn't a simple fraud case. It's a decades-long operation that sold justice for color. The defendants called it adoption. We call it what was legalized theft." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. She pressed a button. Screens behind her lit up with documents, photographs, and signatures. Over 50 caregivers, all black women, labeled mentally unstable. Their children taken, their voices erased. And every single one approved by Morris & Associates, under the financial umbrella of the Reynolds Foundation. Malik stared straight ahead. He didn't blink. The defense attorney rose. "Objection, Your Honor. My client's charity programs have helped hundreds of minority families." Janet turned to him sharply. "By stealing their children?" The room went silent. The judge's gavel hit once. "Overruled." Rosa's name appeared on the screen, her face from 30 years ago. Janet continued. "This woman, Rosa Johnson, was institutionalized under false psychiatric reports signed by Dr. Martinhale and approved by Richard Reynolds himself." The judge leaned forward. "Do we have proof of those reports?" "Yes, Your Honor," Janet said, "and recordings." The court clerk played the audio. Richard's voice filled the room. "She keeps asking for boy. Double her dosage. If she dies, I don't want questions." The courtroom gasped. Cameras clicked wildly. Rosa covered her mouth, tears spilling silently. Malik's jaw clenched. He wanted to look at his father, but he couldn't. Richard sat motionless, staring down. Margaret wept quietly beside him. The judge's voice was grave. "Mr. Reynolds, do you deny this recording?" Richard didn't answer. His lawyer whispered something, but the old man didn't speak. For the first time in his life, power had nothing left to say. Janet's tone softened. "Your Honor, Rosa Johnson was one of many, and her son, the man sitting beside me, built his life on lies written by men who believed their money could rewrite morality." She turned to Malik. "Mr. Johnson, you've submitted hundreds of documents to this court. Why?" Malik stood slowly. Every camera pointed at him. "Because silence is expensive," he said quietly. "And my father paid for it for 30 years. He looked around the courtroom, his voice gaining strength. "They told me my mother abandoned me. They said she was sick, but she wasn't sick. She was stolen. And every child taken like me deserves their truth back." Janet nodded, her eyes fierce. No further questions. The judge gestured toward the defense. "Cross." The defense lawyer approached Malik, smirking. "You seem very sure of your memory, Mr. Johnson. But isn't it possible your so-called mother manipulated you?" Malik leaned forward, voice like thunder. "Manipulated? She didn't even know where I was." You can't manipulate someone you're not allowed to see. A few people in the gallery clapped before the bailiff hushed them. The lawyer backed off. No further questions. Rosa was called next. The courtroom went quiet as she wheeled forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner. They said I was crazy, she said. They said I was unfit. But all I ever did wrong was love my son while being black. The judge's eyes softened. Mrs. Johnson, do you wish to say anything else? She looked at Richard Reynolds and whispered, I forgive you because my freedom deserves peace. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment. The judge took a long pause, then spoke. This court finds the defendants guilty on all counts: fraud, unlawful confinement, and systemic racial discrimination. Each is sentenced to 25 years without parole. A collective sigh rippled through the crowd. Some cried, some clapped, some just sat stunned. Malik turned toward Rosa. She smiled through tears, whispering, We won, baby. He shook his head softly. No, Mama, you did. Outside the courthouse, a storm gathered but didn't fall. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones flashing. Janet Williams addressed them first. Today wasn't about punishment, she said. It was about truth, finally speaking louder than privilege. Behind her, Rosa and Malik stepped into the rain. Cameras swarmed, but for once, neither of them flinched. A reporter called out, Mr. Johnson, what will you do now that justice is served? Malik looked up at the sky. Justice isn't a finish line. It's a start. He held Rosa's hand as thunder rolled in the distance. She smiled. Rain again. He nodded. Yeah, but this time, it's washing away their names, not ours. Rosa laughed softly. Feels like God's signature on a verdict. They walked down the steps together, side by side, no longer victim and lost son, but survivors carrying history in their hands. And as the crowd cheered, the rain finally came, not cold, not harsh, just clean. 2 years had passed since the trial. The city had changed, and so had Malik. Where the old Golden Years nursing home once stood, now rose a bright new sign, the Rosa Johnson Foundation for Family Justice. Inside, the hall smelled of paint and hope instead of bleach and fear. Rosa sat in the garden courtyard, sunlight on her hands as she fed breadcrumbs to the birds. Malik walked out carrying 2 mugs of coffee. They just reunited another family this morning, he said softly. A woman named Carmen finally found her twin boys. Rosa smiled, eyes glistening. See? Love don't die, baby. It just waits till someone's brave enough to go find it. He laughed quietly. You always know the perfect line. She sipped her coffee. That's because I had 30 years to think of it. They sat in silence, letting the sound of children's laughter fill the air. Kids running between the flowers, their mothers watching nearby. The foundation had become a sanctuary for families who once thought justice would never come. Inside, the lobby walls were lined with portraits of mothers and children reunited. Each plaque carried one sentence: love never dies, only waits. Malik stopped at Rosa's portrait, her younger self holding him as a child. He whispered, You waited your whole life, and I made you a promise. I kept it. She placed her hand on his arm. You kept more than a promise. You brought the truth home. He smiled faintly. You ever think about forgiving him? Rosa looked toward the sky. I already did. Forgiveness don't excuse what they did. It just frees me from carrying their chains. Malik nodded slowly. Then you're stronger than I'll ever be. No, baby, she said. You just carried the fight so I could finally rest. Later that evening, the foundation held its first anniversary gala. Malik stood at the podium, cameras flashing again, but this time for the right reasons. 2 years ago, I thought justice was revenge, he said into the mic, but justice is healing, not just for victims, but for a country that keeps forgetting its scars. My mother's story reminded the world that truth might bend, but it doesn't break. Applause filled the hall. Malik turned toward Rosa, sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. He ended his speech with a single line. The truth doesn't need to shout when it finally stands tall. That night, after the guests left, Malik wheeled Rosa onto the balcony overlooking Chicago. The skyline shimmered under the stars. "You ever think about the past?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "But now it hurts less." She looked out at the lights. God sure took his time. Malik smiled gently. Maybe he waited till we were ready. She squeezed his hand. "Keep fighting for the ones still waiting." "I will," he whispered. The city wind brushed against him, carrying the faint sound of church bells from downtown. Rosa looked at him with the same love that had survived everything. "They stole our 30 years, Malik," she said softly, "but they never stole our story." He smiled back. "And now, the whole world finally knows it." The wind moved to the balcony like to quiet him. Soft, steady, eternal. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Dark Truths, where real pain turns into powerful justice and love proves stronger than hate. That night, Malik turned off the foundation lights, leaving only one frame glowing in the hallway. Him and Rosa, smiling beneath the words "Love never dies, only waits." Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle this time, like applause from the heavens.